Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derek. With me, as is the case every single time, is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, so we are finishing up our fifth of five episodes on Genesis 2, 16, and 17.
It's the
So,
finale,
yeah, yeah, we're finally wrapping this one
culmination
up.
right here.
I'll read it real quick, so we just have familiarity with it again. And the Lord commanded the man, saying, "You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you surely shall die." So we set that down. All right. So this episode uh, may seem boring at first, and I will grant you that. This sounds like a
More
boring
more
topic.
than all the other ones? Wait a second.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Uh,
This sounds like a boring topic, but it actually matters, and we'll get to why at the end. Okay, so there is some discussion around whether or not this couple of verses, this passage, constitutes a covenant.
Mhm.
So what we're going to do is we're first going to take a look at why some people claim that. Then I'm going to explain why I don't see it as one. And in doing so, maybe we'll get an idea of an understanding of covenants more broadly. And then lastly, we'll consider why this question matters and why I think there's a negative impact to getting it wrong. So, um, to start with, a covenant is, it's basically an agreement among parties. You know,
Mhm.
you'll do this, I'll do this, or whatever, right? That's really all it is. But in the Bible, there are a few different covenants that exist between God and individuals, God and Israel, and God and his church and humanity as a whole.
Mhm.
And so there is a desire to include this among those array of covenants, if you will. And one issue with this is the Bible never specifically refers to this as a covenant, except it is argued that Hosea 6:7 is. But depending on how you read the phrasing of the verse, uh, I don't think that's true. So what the verse says is, "But like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. They dealt faithlessly with me."
Mhm.
So uh, there's a case to be made here that the word being translated as Adam refers to men, because Adam or even Ha-Adam is like the man or men or humanity
Mhm.
as a whole or all of
Mhm.
that. And in fact, the King James translation does actually translate it that way.
Mhm.
So there is a case to be made that it's just referring to humanity more broadly. Likewise, or not likewise, but either way, actually, I think this verse doesn't necessarily indicate, though, that what we are seeing is a covenant. So the verse could simply be referring to Adam or man, not in the pattern of having broken a specific covenant, but rather that it is the pattern of man to sin and thus break covenants. So it's not a question of referring back to a specific covenant with Adam being broken here, but it's that because of the humanness of people, right? It's because they are like Adam, and in the way in which they are like Adam, that led to their breaking of the covenant.
Okay.
So it's not, it's if we look back at the verse, it's sort of but they, like Adam, they transgressed the covenant, meaning their transgression is like Adam, not their transgression of the covenant is like Adam transgressing the covenant, right? It's just the transgression that is the emphasis there,
Mhm.
not specifically related to the covenant. So my point here, I'm not suggesting to say that's definitively what this verse is saying. I'm just saying that in light of the other arguments I'm about to make, I'm suggesting that there's some ambiguity to what this verse means, and it is insufficient on its own to justify like a rejection of what I'm about to say. So in terms of what I'm about to say. I think if you point to this verse and say, yeah, well, maybe all those things are true, but this verse says it's a covenant. I'm not so sure that this verse says it's a covenant. That's one way of reading it, but it definitely is not the only way you could read that, for sure. It's murky to that end. So,
of course, the possibility of other interpretations is always available.
right.
I think if you're wanting to argue that it's not saying that that Adam had a covenant, you have farther. I think the translation issue is a better argument, and saying that potentially it's saying,
right,
they were. It's not referencing Adam specifically, but is referencing men. Like men, they transgress the covenant.
And I think that is probably the better translation there as well. Especially, again, given that it's not like this is referred to as a covenant anywhere else in the Bible.
Well, and I guess it's even more important to say that any other covenants are referred to
as covenants. Yes.
Frequently.
Yes.
Frequently. It's come back to very, very often the covenants that are established.
Right.
The covenant with Abraham is reiterated time and time again as a covenant by God. And so it would be odd that this is an offhand one that's never referenced again going forward, but the one with Abraham is referenced over and over and over and over.
Right.
And over again.
Right.
So that would seem odd that it's just one line in Hosea is a callback to it, whereas the other ones have a lot more callbacks.
Yes.
That's fair.
So I think in the end here, what's going on is that many people have developed such sort of an appreciation for the idea of covenants with God, which is rightly so, right? They're really an incredible idea when you think about them. The idea of the God who created anything, everything, having any kind of an agreement with man. That's sort of unbelievable, right? When we think of how small we are in comparison. But the problem is that appreciation has led to reading something into this particular passage here that it isn't necessarily that particular thing, right?
It would be strange too, because we've talked about in past episodes, talking through this verse, we've hacked out the fact that this is something that is broken, and the end of the wager that God kind of established, or the end of the deal that God established, isn't upheld, or isn't obviously upheld. In that the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. We've hacked at that.
We'll get to that, obviously.
Look, either God's being vague, or it's metaphorical, or something's going on there. So in terms of actual structure, it's not obvious. I mean, Abraham's promised to be the father of many nations, and he is the father of many nations. In a literal sense, he is the father of a variety of nations.
Right.
Like that's not ambiguous. That's not.
I think God upholds this end. It's just it's not immediate, but he does uphold it. Right?
It depends on how you interpret it. Is it immediate death? Is the day a metaphorical? It depends on how you interpret it, which we've already hacked at.
Yeah, and we'll get to that more when we get to the actual expulsion from the garden as well. So because I'll say one line about that, which is that if life is to be in the garden, if that's what it means to truly be alive, then you do kind of die on the day of expulsion from the garden.
Yeah.
Right. It's not maybe death as clear as like we think of death, but if that's what it means to truly be alive, then when you're kicked out, you die. So on that day, you did kind of die. But moving on, let's return to covenants here real quickly. And let's look at the nature of covenants in general. And I think the main thing I think we need to consider here is that every stated covenant in the Bible, and again, this is not stated by God to be a covenant, but every stated covenant in the Bible between God and humanity, it occurs in a world that is already corrupted by sin.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I think if you look carefully at and think through the nature of each of these covenants, what's really going on in these covenants that God establishes, they are all aimed more or less at addressing the effects of sin upon the world, right? Even the covenant with Abraham, right, is out of him is a nation that will, work to mitigate the effects of sin on the world and ultimately produce the cure, right, in Jesus. And so the nature of covenants, if it is a characteristic of God's covenants that they are meant to address sin, how could these verses, which occur in the absence of the corruption of sin, be called a covenant? That logic doesn't sustain, right? Covenants exist because the world is broken by sin. The system broken by sin, it can't be maintained from within anymore, right? Man, because of our sin, we can't do the ordering for which we were created. The imagers are incapable of doing the imagers of God, right? Which is what we are incapable of doing anything to keep the system from spinning out of control back into chaos. And so God steps in to sustain the system, but he doesn't do so without our doing our part as well. That's hence the agreement. If a covenant is on one side, man will do one thing and God will then do this, because man is behaving rightly, though inadequately to sort of fully be the image of God. God sort of steps in and says, well, I will provide the rest of the solution. I'll make up the difference, right? So if we look more specifically at an Old Testament covenant, it basically says, you've broken the system, it's corrupted, so you need help to keep things from falling apart. So do these things and I will sustain it, right? But here you don't have God telling Adam, I'll do this if you do this. He's telling Adam, this is the role that you play in my grand design, my order, right? Go no further than this. And because this order was made for you to enjoy and to sustain you, if you operate outside of that design, the system will break and it won't sustain you any longer, the death, right? But and that's kind of a continuation of what we saw in the first chapter, the ordering process, with man being this means by which, as the image of God, you're supposed to continue the ordering process. So I think it's a mistake to view this as a description of even what God is saying here. It's not even descriptive of the relationship between God and man. It's a description of the relationship between man and creation. God is saying, look, if you don't do things rightly, the system doesn't work for you. The order will fall apart. Mm-hmm. If you don't not sin, not eat of the fruit of that tree, then you'll die because you're breaking the order of things.
Yeah, I guess
that's not even God proactively like doing anything there. He's just describing the way creation exists.
Yeah, that's what's, I think, significant. I think that's the end point, is that God is not describing to a person what I'm going to do with you. Is describing the natural results of your actions,
right?
Which I think we keep coming back to the parenting example, and I think good parenting is something that does something to that effect. It's like, why do you want to teach your children to get along with other children? It's like, not because you're going to punish them if they don't get along with other children. It's because if they don't get along with other children, then as they grow and develop, they're not going to be able to associate with people appropriately. And then they're going to become a social outcast. And then they're going to have difficulty that comes along with being a social outcast, is they're not going to be able to have reliable friendships. They're not going to be able to develop relationships with other people. They're going to likely fall into depression. And so it's like, as a parent, you're not trying to teach the child to do this because you're going to reprimand them. That might be a tool you use, but you're doing it because the natural result of them not being able to do this is that rejection.
It's the disorder, yeah.
And so if you're coming back to this, is God's not saying, I'm going to punish you if this happens. God's saying, if you do this, the world will reject you. The creation will reject you the way it's fundamentally established. And so don't do this, not because I'm going to come down and lay the hammer down. And he doesn't say that. He doesn't say for
I'm going to come down and kill you.
I shall surely kill you. Exactly. It's you shall surely die. That's the natural result. This is poisonous. If you eat poison, you'll die.
Right.
Now that he's saying it's poisonous, but that's the idea.
Right.
That is a significant difference. Because definitely if you're talking about a covenant, which we a lot of times, and I don't know if you're going to take exception to this, but we a lot of times think of them as contracts, is if you break one end of the contract, what ends up happening is the party can seek restitution, or they can choose not to seek restitution. That's the result of breaking a contract, is the other party then has to get on you in order to uphold the thing. This is saying, no, just if you do this, which is a far, I think is a far better way to work with people in life, because people can eat the natural results of their actions. Or you can tell them to eat the natural results of their actions and say, look, we're coming up against reality here. You either have to change the way you're operating, or reality will reject you.
Right. So I think we're starting to get into the question of like why this matters, right? Why does it matter that we shouldn't call this a covenant? Maybe we shouldn't teach that idea, right?
Yeah.
And I think the primary reason for me is that it cheapens the pre-fall dynamic, right? The pre-expulsion from the garden. Particularly what is described in terms of the relationship between God and man, right? Because again, I think it's actually about the relationship between man and creation, not God and man. And the world that God had, given man in this story is one that would sustain man. He would eat from the tree of life, right? So long as he acted rightly in his role as the imager of God. This is not a situation where God needed to step in and sustain it. I mean, he does in the sense that obviously being God, all creation is sort of sustained through him, but it's not like it's this proactive thing that he's doing. He had made creation so completely, so beautifully that it was ready to sustain. So the relationship between man and God, I think in this Edenistic perspective, is more akin to a parent-child relationship. That's what you see here. All right. But a covenant is not that. A covenant is an agreement between parties to uphold their ends of the bargain. You bring up contract. I would call it it's kind of like a barter of the most important kind, right? I mean, that sounds a bit crass. And in a way, I mean, I understand why that sounds crass to people. But it's the same pattern, just, in terms of importance, tremendously more important than any barter you're going and doing in the town square market or whatever, but this is why the husband and wife relationship is also a covenant. It's two parties committing to each other in certain ways on a more even level. It's not the parent child relationship. But if we look at the story of the Bible, I think we notice an interesting progression. If I can continue to work with this, parent-child relationship thing, right? Man begins with God. It's you begin in a state of being a child of God, right? In this way, but after sin, God makes covenant agreements with Israel, his chosen people. Who are often actually described in terms of the Old Testament, particularly in Ezekiel and stuff, as his bride, right? And when they break covenants, when Israel breaks covenants, it's often described as being like an unfaithful spouse, right? So this explains why God can't make a covenant sort of with man directly, God the Father, sort of, that there's something about that just doesn't work. But finally, with the new covenant with Jesus, now we see an interesting situation where now you're a part of the church, which is married to Christ, the Son of God. And when we accept the gift of salvation and become a part of the church. We become a part of the bride of Christ. And just as many parents will accept their children's spouses as their own, and even extend to adopting, the title of mother and father, so does God the Father through Christ see us as his sons-in-laws and daughters-in-laws, right? And so we know that when the day comes, we'll find ourselves, fully glorified and returned to the status as children of God. And I think that's the story we're seeing in the Bible, right? Which is pretty fascinating. This idea of being the children of God and losing that status, yet God creating this pathway to return. First showing that through Israel, it's like there's something incorrect about the direct covenant with God. Not that Jesus isn't God, Jesus is God, but something like working through, the Son of God, Christ, that part of the Trinity or whatever, it being the bride of that works more clearly or something. I don't know what exactly, I don't know what God's reason is for having to work it that way, but perhaps it is the connection with an actual man in Christ makes the difference, because clearly, just God the Father wasn't enough. Israel kept screwing up. But with Jesus, there's a greater connection there. But you get that whole story, that whole dynamic, right? So the problem for me is that if we fail to see this kind of pre-fall and post, sanctification, glorification dynamic of the relationship between God and men, what it's meant to be, then we lack something about the understanding of the true nature of sin. We fail to see how deeply the chasm it causes truly runs, right? And if we can't understand the true corruptive nature of sin, then I think we don't fully have a proper understanding of what is meant to be in terms of the absence of sin, right? What is the real gift of salvation in Christ? So to me, lumping in this pre-fall, command might not even be the right word of God's, this pre-fall description of reality that God's offers, if we lump that in with the corrective nature of covenants, which again, they're corrective of the harm of sin, I think it diminishes our ability to really grasp what the story of the whole Bible is in terms of what God is really doing there. Going to that child, spouse, all that whole relationship.
Well, it connects a lot with your that entire idea connects a lot with your idea of progression of humanity as a developmental stage.
The Bible containing like a maturation process of humanity within it.
Well, yeah, and then I would look at this not as command, but even as instruction. That might be the proper term here, because you may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of that tree of knowledge you shall not eat, for on that day you shall surely die. This is a warning sign. You're going to fall off a cliff if you go over here.
Descriptive. Careful. I think not even instruction, right? It's descriptive, even a warning sign, right? It doesn't tell you don't jump off this cliff. It just lets you know that if you fall off this cliff, there's going to be trouble.
It's a so that is an interesting idea. So then we go from this process of living the role of the children of God, and then after expulsion from Eden, the covenants after that are the way in which a man makes a covenant with another man, or a woman with another woman, or anyone makes another covenant with an adult. An adult. And then we ultimately end up with the situation of Christ being that perfect covenant. And
the mediator why that between God the Father and humanity. God the Son is the mediator.
Well, and that's interesting, the idea that you reestablish the role of being children of God. I want to re-emphasize that because you said a lot there, and that's the interesting pattern, is going from children of God to being expulsed from the garden, and then having covenants as adults would with adults in this way with God, and then and then, I mean, the Trinity is odd, but the identity of God splits, let's say, and you have this adult with adult covenant that takes place between Christ and the church, which is represented by marriage, which is two adults, and then that results in this
not adult, let's say man to man, right? It's like the idea that covenants between God and man will always fail, and covenants between man and man, there's something that we're more forgiving of like the man-to-man covenant or something there, right? There's the idea that like that works because it's not like up a hierarchy. But Jesus, being also God, is able to covenant with God the Father and uphold his end of the bargain. And then if we can hold up our end of the bargain with him, and he requires less of us than God required of Israel, let's say, that it's now you have humanity covenanting with a human, and you have in Jesus God covenanting with God, and that like creates the connective chain in a way, right?
Yeah.
He's the midpoint upon which all of that hinges, and it works being both God and man as Jesus was.
Yeah. Well, what ultimately happens is that's what I think is so interesting is the covenant stays. We continue to have covenant relationships with God, but the children of God relationship is reestablished by that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That was lost in Eden. And so that's very interesting. That's, I just think that's it is a strange way in which you're having your cake and eating it too, I guess. Right. You're having both things happen somehow.
Well, yeah, in Eden,
and shocking.
And the key is in Eden, it's like the description here is like, no, you just are a child of God, except you're going to fail in that role. And so then ultimately covenants are this chain of covenants is the way in which that connection is reestablished. So to go and claim that this original design is a covenant, no, you're now cheapening the value of what the chain of covenants actually does. And that I think is important, I guess. So, all right. Well, with that, I think we're going to finally wrap up the fifth of 5 episodes on these verses. And next time, we're going to continue on to Genesis 2:18 and take a look at that as we shift into kind of the next phase here of this story of the garden. So until then, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, Rumble, podcast reviews, whatever it is you want to do. Email us unschooledtheology@protonmail.com, and we'll see you then. Thanks.